It's a quite fresh and different perspective than you might have had previously. So we'll dive right in. So I'm the CEO and co-founder of Demand Driven Technologies. We provide the world's leading DDMRP solution in Replenishment Plus. We are also the first to be certified as compliant with DD&S&OP with our advanced planning module. And we will soon be launching our IntuiFlow release coming up this December, which will also incorporate demand-driven capacity scheduling and execution in the same cloud environment. So we'll talk about the traditional sales and operations planning approach, and I'll go quickly through this because many of you will be very familiar with these concepts, but I just want to use that as a baseline for kind of setting the tone as to what is different about demand-driven sales and operations planning. We'll talk about some of the limitations of S&OP as it's typically performed, and then we'll move forward from there. So one of the greatest concepts about sales and operations planning, and this really got started back in the mid-'80s, as companies who had implemented planning systems like MRP were finding that they really needed to develop more coordination between the business side of the house, meaning the sales and marketing end of things, with the actual operations side, and ensure that there was better alignment of materials and operations to what the company expected to sell into the market. A gentleman named Dick Ling, I've had many meetings with Dick over the years, really brought this forward to the market, and it really became a very popular initiative for many companies to follow. It's all very logical. If we get a better understanding of where our business is coming from in terms of what our forecast looks like or our demand plan, then we can do a better job of ensuring that all our production resources, our materials, our suppliers are aligned to meet that demand. And as many would say, it's getting the team on the same page. And that was really kind of the hope and promise of what sales and operations planning was about. There's these steps, typically about 5 to 6 steps in the process: forecasting and demand planning, then the resulting supply plan to meet that, something called the pre-S&OP meeting, where the functional executives and their teams are meeting to ensure that everybody has met, discussed all the implications of what that supply and demand plan look like, and then a final confirming meeting with the executives in the company, which then proceeds going ahead and finally implementing. So what are we trying to accomplish in each of those phases? Obviously, in forecasting, we're trying to get a better and more clear understanding of what we will be selling into the market. Typically, this is done by gathering and using historical demand as a baseline, getting input from a sales department, from other parts of the organization that influence what is being sold in the market. There will typically be some adjusting and factoring that will occur based on internal and external factors that are understood and likely to influence our results. And we start to get and crystallize what that forecast would look like. Demand planning is just another layer on that activity, which allows us to get some further socialization of the forecast across the organization to get better feedback and make sure that we've got everybody's input on it. Some further adjustments may be made. And that really becomes kind of the foundation around which all of the other activities are going to be achieved. So companies will have a substantial investment in a demand planning department to help facilitate this process. And it's their job to come in very close to the target in terms of what that forecast looks like. Now, one of the things that happens, and Valerie mentioned this a little bit in his presentation, is that there needs to be some level of aggregation done. That's because with product proliferation and the expansion of the product portfolio in many companies, it becomes more and more difficult to forecast at the item level. Even though that's what the consumer is buying, a given item, they don't buy the category typically. We now have this challenge of trying to figure out within that aggregated plan what the distribution of that forecast will be across the various stock keeping items within that aggregation. That can also influence the timing aspect as well. Instead of planning in weeks or months, we plan at quarter levels, and those things can introduce some distortions into the process as well. So the forecast, demand planning, very critical to the S&OP concept. The supply plan then is the result of that. What do we need to buy, build, assemble, and distribute to meet that demand. And it's going to have some impacts. There's going to be perhaps some capacity limitations that we need to address. We need to give our suppliers an idea of the amount of volume that we're going to be procuring from them. We want to make sure that they're going to be aligned. And there may be some back and forth that we'll iterate on between the supply and the demand plan based on some of these constraints. Once we've done all of this, now we have demand and supply kind of aligned. We can have our pre-S&OP meeting, make sure that all the functional executives are on board and aligned and in agreement with what the overall plan is, which then leads up to the executive meeting. And these will typically take, there isn't just one meeting, there will typically be some iterations because questions will come up and there will be discussion on various topics. But the real purpose of this is to ensure that the company is bought into the plan. It may turn into operational targets and budgets for various departments to pursue and be measured against. But that's really the purpose, to make sure that everybody is aligned and focused on executing the plan based on that forecast we've developed and all the resulting expectations. And so then we start the gears turning and we implement our plan. And what happens? Well, too often, the plan isn't quite right, because the forecast really misses something. Many of the clients that we've worked with are talking about forecast accuracy at the item level of less than 60%. The forecasts tend to be missing key trends that are out in the market, and there's some challenges that will emerge as a result of that. And that's that actual to forecast kind of gap starts to emerge and becomes more and more visible as time passes. And this can also be contributed to by the fact that there tends to be some demand smoothing done. Many of the algorithms that are out there are intended to take some of the lumpiness out of the demand plan. And in fact, that's part of some of the reality that we need to be recognizing. So we have tended to water down this. I saw this in my IBM career time and again, not only internally in my job as VP of Operations for the consulting division, but also in the interactions that we were having with clients, is that they're really challenged to get a forecast and demand plan that actually became the reality that they managed against. On the supplying side, there's always variation. We've had a lot of challenges across our client base, fighting very difficult issues due to the COVID pandemic and the like. But even in more normal times, there are issues where the supply plan becomes a bit out of alignment as well, where there's variance from the forecast influencing this. That's causing impacts on our production and our supplier tiers. There tends to be the firefighting. I heard Valerie mention the bullwhip effect, and that's very much a reality that companies have to deal with. And so there's all of this extra effort that's going on, and it makes it for very, very difficult times trying to fight our way through this. So in spite of the fact that we tried our best, and I saw this at IBM especially, what part of my job was to get every part of the consulting business aligned to what our forecast would be and ensuring that we had the right skills and talent on our team to meet the expected demand. The forecasts weren't accurate. Areas were growing much faster than we expected. Other areas were seeing, flatten or declining rates of consumption. We had to find ways to pivot and become more nimble and agile in the business. And, it really wasn't part of the planning process to create that flexibility for us. And I've seen many of our clients that we've talked to about this are echoing the same kind of operational challenges that they've been finding. Anytime we plan ahead in the concept of an APS system or advanced planning system, we are committing resources to the forecast well before the actual demand is known. And that creates part of the challenge here for us because, borrowing from the theory of constraints, one of the most critical aspects is to wait as long as possible before taking action, because anything tied to the future is likely to change. And so it's learning how to build more agility that becomes part of what the learning lessons have been from companies that have implemented S&OP. I spoke with a global consumer goods company based in the US, an extremely well-known brand around the world, who told me, in our discussions that they pretty much gave up on S&OP a long time ago because of the various issues that I'm describing here. It just did not really work to the theory as much as they had hoped for. So the big question really is about building agility. How do we create agility and responsiveness into our operating model and our capabilities so that we can adapt and be able to capitalize on whatever the market brings us? In other words, if we had infinite flexibility, we wouldn't need to plan ahead, right? Because we could take whatever orders came in, respond immediately, and be able to react in a much, much more effective manner. So and while that theoretically is impossible to reach, anything we can do to build into this direction will help us, right? It's about building adaptability and agility into our model instead of being totally reliant on prediction. And the more effective we create this operational flexibility, the more resilient we become, and actually the workload for doing this becomes much, much easier. We have to move from being aligned and putting all the organization through the stress to align to an uncertain future into building that agility. We have to move away from a single consensus plan that was laboriously put together to being able to adapt and support a range of scenarios, not just one plan, but a range of high, medium, and low kind of scenarios. Because the more we have that flexibility, the more we're going to be aligned to meet whatever the market brings us. We've been moving from planning to a flawed demand forecast to a more accurate one. Obviously, demand-driven, true pull-based systems have the most accurate demand signal we're going to find, and it's developing the techniques for allowing that to be our primary signal of demand is much, much more effective. We need to move away from these tightly coupled dependencies, planning dependencies, which cause the bullwhip effect, to leveraging strategic decoupling points. That's a foundational concept in DDMRP and the demand-driven adaptive enterprise. And then obviously we want to try to get away from this global, I call it celestial alignment, aligning the planets and the stars, to a lighter weight exception management approach that allows us to put our attention on where do we really need to worry. If we were a pilot flying an airliner across the Atlantic, we're really not flying the plane that much. The system is doing the job. And what we should be focusing on, where are the exceptions? Where are the conditions that we may need to make and get involved in? The more we understand those, focus on those, and let the other things take care of themselves, the better it's going to be for all of us to have a successful approach. So let's talk about the elements of this. The foundation of it is what's called the demand-driven operating model. And there are two elements that really are critical in that. First, on the left is demand-driven MRP as our planning mechanism for our materials. And then on the right is demand-driven capacity scheduling and execution, which is about using a true demand-driven signal to plan our production and operations, and the use of time and capacity buffers as a way of creating some decoupling within the production environment to give us more resiliency and more adaptability to whatever variation we're going to encounter. Valerie had this slide in his deck as well, and I think this is an important place to really distinguish what's unique about DDS and OP. Remember, our demand-driven operating model on the left here is really intended to pace to actual demand in the market. The more we can use actual demand, the more accurate our signal will be, and we'll start to take some of the noise out of the system. That involves DDMRP for materials and demand-driven capacity scheduling for operations. On the right side, every company is evolving. You still need a forecast, but you need to use it in a different way. The forecast is there to help us get us an idea of where the company is evolving, what are the new conditions we're going to need to understand, and the critical linkage between these two worlds, a forecast-driven world of where we will be in the future, and this can go well out into the future, perhaps out to 78 weeks or thereabouts. The critical link in the middle here is demand-driven S&OP. What we use that information about the future to do is not to plan directly to it, but to test and ensure that our demand-driven operating model has the proper settings and the proper configuration so that whatever actual demand comes along, which will be different than that forecast, we have the flexibility and adaptability to be able to support. So it's not about planning, it's about generating master settings and changes in our model. It's also about using variance analysis and understanding how we've performed to date to allow us to further refine our operating model and the settings in that environment. And this kind of loop around DDS and OP has to be focused in the proper, what's called relevant ranges. In other words, we don't need to worry about things that are way out into the future other than to get indicators or understand what possible conditions are out there. We really want to focus DDS and OP around what's called the tactical range in terms of a time horizon. Typically, your longest decoupled lead time plus a buffer factor of a few more weeks. And within that range, you should be testing your operating model, worrying about what we've learned from the past variance analysis and using it to continually improve the alignment of that model to the actual conditions. We do this by...
You have 3 or 5 minutes more, okay?
Okay, yep. To do this, we will review how our stock buffers have been performing. We'll review how our capacity has been utilized. We'll review how our time buffers have been performing. And these time buffers help ensure that our constraints within our production environment are being optimally utilized, that our standards, for example, our routings, our setup times, and cutover times are accurate, because the more dialed in all of those become, the more resilient our operating model will be and the more flexible it'll be. We want to focus within a relevant range. From a DDS and OP, that's typically going to be roughly 10 to 13 week kind of a horizon. Things beyond that are going to change before we get to that point in time. So while we'll take a look at that, our real focus is going to be on things that we can control and things that are within a short enough horizon that we can have greater confidence in the accuracy and the input that we're looking at. We want to run and test our operating model around a range of scenarios, high, medium, low, different product mixes, other factors like that, and see where the DDOM may become into points of stress. These would be through things like rough cut capacity planning, projected supply, projected inventory levels. Where do we exceptions? Are there changes that we need to make in our buffer profiles, in our capacity assumptions? Do we need extra shifts? Are we getting to a point where we're going to need extra production resources and the like? And ensure that we've got that adaptability and flexibility. And by doing this, we really minimize the amount of damage that the inaccuracies in our forecasts are going to do to our environment. These strategic projections allow us to get a much better understanding. We can use this within our management discussions to talk about how do we really configure and operate our business in a manner that gives us much more flexibility and ensures that we're better prepared to deal with whatever evolves out in the marketplace. And this applies both on the material side as well as the capacity side. And clearly, the more flexibility we've got, the more confident we can be that we're going to be in great shape as we go forward. It's all about this concept of demand-driven operating model and ensuring that we are configuring it properly to meet the expected conditions. It's not about committing and planning and locking everything down to that consensus demand plan as traditional S&OP teaches. It's about looking for the master settings and as well using our variance analysis to further make adjustments in the way our operating model is deployed to give us the best results over time. We've seen in clients that are using this that they're getting more efficient, they're getting more confidence in the way the operating model goes. I think Valerie made a great point about simplified planning and the desire to get to more and more automation. I absolutely believe in this. I think we can make S&OP a much more viable process if we follow these demand-driven principles. So many of the smaller clients we've worked with over the years have kind of waved off S&OP because it's viewed to be so labor-intensive and not really productive. I think they see in the DDS and OP approach a fresh thought about looking at really kind of that exception management kind of concept and how they can get better organizational leverage out of that. A lot of this material was borrowed from the materials of the Demand Driven Institute. There's quite a bit of education available, and I encourage you to take advantage of that. And Sviatoslav and the ABM team are quite good at providing the certification training and other things like that for you as well. So with that, I'm going to